Welcome to the Ideal Investor Show. Join us on the journey to financial success. Let's go. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Ideal Investor Show. And today's topic is revolving around different ways to invest in residential real estate. And just to clarify real quick, we're talking about asset classes. And normally when you talk about asset classes, you look at the difference between, let's say, stocks and commodities like gold and silver, and real estate as something that is less mobile and less flexible. Now, what we are doing today is to say, okay, but how is it within real estate? And there are three main classes. The one is residential, the other one is commercial residential, and the third one is commercial. So commercial is literally like an office building or retail or any kind of factory. Commercial residential is anything like a big apartment complex or a resort or something like that that has more than 5 doors or 5 units within the overall property. And then the traditional residential is anything like single family homes, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, those kind of things. So if you now go into just the residential part as an asset class and say, well, what do we have available within that? And there are, again, 3 asset classes within just the residential, at least 3 kind of that I'm familiar with. The one is the long-term residential investing. The second one is the medium-term residential investing. And the third one is the short-term, or a lot of people also call it Airbnb or VRBO, which stands for basically you're renting a whole house or a whole apartment instead of just a room, whereas Airbnb is more like a hotel. What we want to address today is the question within those 3 categories between long-term rental, which is what we typically do and suggest for our clients when they join the Ideal Wealth Grower mentoring program, and short-term rental, which one is better, or is one better, or what are the criteria between those 2 asset classes? And fundamentally, with everything in real estate, to make it fair, you would basically have to start out to say, if I had a house in the same location and I had the choice to do Airbnb and I had or short-term rental versus long-term rental. And that is really a tricky thing. If we take an example for my own portfolio, where I have, for example, a house in Dayton, Ohio. Now, there are a few things going on there. There is a large Air Force base and a little Air Force museum there, and there's a large university and a few other things going on, but it's not necessarily known as a vacation or tourist location. And you compare that, let's say, with some place in Florida right by the beach. Right. And so if we had one house in Dayton and one house in Florida by the beach, and we were to ask ourselves that question, is it better to do long term or is it better to do short term? The outcome is different. So let's start with the one in Dayton, Ohio. There we have a relatively stable workforce, a relatively stable economy. The value of properties is not increasing a lot, but the industry is also not fluctuating a lot. So if you compare how much can you get from a short-term rental versus a long-term rental on a monthly basis, fundamentally, you would still make more money if you had a short-term rental than a long-term rental. Why? Let's take a house where we would say, okay, we have a $240,000 house and we can make $2,000 of rent in the long-term rental. Right? If you think about that, that comes out for all 30 days of the average month. That comes out for the tenants to rent that house to a little more than $65 per day. And if you compare that to a short-term rental, a whole house with like 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a garden and so forth, people would easily pay more, let's say $100, $120, $150 per day. So from that starting point, $60, if you convert the long-term rent versus $100, $120, $150, the short-term would win. Now, the problem is if the house is not in a very desirable vacation location and not typically used for people like traveling nurses or people who are on projects or anything like that, that just travel through, because short-term rental, keep in mind, is typically 5 to 7 days at the maximum, and more likely 3 to 5 days. That's considered short term. I know by the rules you can go all the way to 30 days, but that is really already starting to be midterm rental. So short, let's say for a week, versus long term for like a year. Now here comes the really pivotal point. If you could say I can charge $120 for the short-term rental and $60 for the long-term rental, you would basically break even if the house for short-term rental is occupied half of the time, 15 days a month, every month. Then the only real difference in the end is your house for long-term rental is empty, and your house for short-term rental obviously needs to be furnished. And every time guests come through, you have to go back in and do new sheets and new towels and clean everything up and so forth. So the cost to run the short-term rental is higher, and the long-term rental is lower. So if you financially just break even, the short-term rental would still not be as good. So you would have to have more than 50% occupancy every month throughout the whole year to beat the long-term house in Dayton. Now let's switch that same house that we have, that $240,000 house, to somewhere at the beach in Florida. Now you might be able to charge more rent there than in Dayton. So let's say instead of $2,000, you get $2,500 in the long-term rental. But now look at the short term. For a full house, especially in the summertime and during spring break and certain events and stuff like that, a whole house where like 6, 8, 10 people can stay would probably rent more for like $200 or $300 a day, right? If you take that then to 30 days, and let's say it were $250, that would be $7,500 a month versus $2,500 a month. So the short term would be 3 times as much. Now, will it always be occupied 100% of the time? No. But even if we were just to say, okay, it's only occupied on average throughout the whole year, it's only occupied half the time, it would still make double the rent compared to the long term. So in desirable locations where it's very likely that people pay significantly more per day than you could get for a long-term rental, even if your occupancy is only 50%, it is probably worth considering short-term. So what's the lesson? It's not really the one is better than the other. It is mainly dependent on a house of equal value, equal size, equal utility in the right location. Short-term is probably better. And in a location where not that many people come through, there's not a high desire to stay short-term for a week or so, then the long term is better. So you want to look at what do you want. Now, one final aspect, I mentioned the furnace thing and the much higher management that you have in a short-term rental. This is an aspect that an investor has also to consider, because long-term turnkey investing like we recommend is relatively low work for you as the investor. Your property manager is managing the tenants, they collect the money, send you the money so you can pay your mortgage, or good, relatively easy. In my case, with my portfolio, I only spend like a few hours a month. On a short-term rental where there is so much more stuff going on, even if you have a management company who does all the bookings and all the cleaning stuff and so forth, it is important to consider, and obviously they don't do this for the same 8 to 10% of your rent. They probably want to have something closer to 20 or 25% of the rent. So this location aspect and the higher volume of involvement is also something to consider. So if you want to have like a calmer situation where there is maybe a change once a year or every few years versus like weekly or bi-weekly, that's another choice. So for getting potentially more money in a better location that is very usable for short-term rental, yes, you will have more involvement, but you can make more money. If you want it more calm and steady and not a whole lot going on, then in a location like that, you're better off with long-term rental. So that's basically the message, and I hope that tells you a little bit what to consider, assuming the houses are equal, fundamentally equal, and the only difference is the location. Those are some of the considerations, and I hope that was helpful for you. So this is just a little glimpse of what we're talking about when we're evaluating properties. And so if you can say, wow, this is really interesting, there is a whole mountain of more information, and I would love to introduce it to you. So if you're interested to find out what is this mentoring program about and how can I actually get involved in real estate investing myself, then please go to idealwealthgrower.com and find the button where you can book a discovery call, and we have a conversation and we see if it's for you and if I can help you. So that's it for today. Be well and stay safe, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.